Donald Trump built his political empire on a promise: America first. Factories humming again, jobs flooding back, independence from foreign powers. He told voters he would bring back the golden age of American manufacturing, from cars and steel to energy and technology. The U.S., he said, would no longer need anyone, but today America's future doesn't rest in Detroit or Silicon Valley. It rests across the southern border, in Mexico, because while Trump was busy waging trade wars and bullying his neighbors, Mexico quietly positioned itself at the center of the 21st century's most important industry, batteries. And the resource that makes it possible? Lithium. Lithium isn't just another mineral. It's the backbone of everything from electric cars to smartphones, from renewable energy storage to the military hardware that powers satellites and drones. Without lithium, America can't fight wars, can't build cars, can't keep up in the global tech race. It is the oil of the 21st century. And here's the shocking twist. Mexico now controls one of the world's largest untapped reserves, right at America's doorstep. For decades, Washington dismissed Mexico as a junior partner, a source of cheap labor and migrant debates. Trump especially mocked it, treating Mexico as a punching bag for his border wall politics. But in 2022, Mexico flipped the script, nationalizing its lithium and forming a state-owned company to control extraction. In one move, it went from bystander to power broker. And the irony? It was Trump's very policies that set the stage. His tariffs, his trade disputes, his obsession with winning pushed Mexico to assert control, shutting America out of what could be the most decisive resource of the century. So here's the question. What happens when the U.S. can't build batteries without Mexico's permission? What happens when the neighbor Trump insulted suddenly holds the key to America's economic and military future? And what does it say about American power when the empire is forced to beg the underdog for survival? This isn't just about minerals. It's about arrogance, betrayal, and a backfire that could reshape North America forever. To see how Trump's grand vision collapsed into dependence, we need to start with his promises and the reality he delivered when Donald Trump promised America first. He painted a simple picture: a nation unshackled from foreign dependence, manufacturing restored, and U.S. workers thriving. He told farmers, factory workers, and miners that America's glory days could return if only he was in charge. No more outsourcing, no more begging other countries for resources. America, he said, would dominate energy and industry on its own terms. But the vision was a mirage. Because while Trump shouted about independence, his policies created deeper dependence. His trade wars disrupted supply chains. His tariffs punished allies just as much as rivals. And his short-term obsession with political victories blinded him to the very future that was unfolding under his nose. Take Mexico. For decades, it was treated by Washington as a convenient backdrop: cheap labor for assembly plants, a market for American corn, a neighbor to lecture about immigration. Trump doubled down on this attitude, using Mexico as a political punching bag. He slapped tariffs on steel and aluminum, threatened auto imports, and constantly weaponized the border wall debate to humiliate his southern neighbor. But here's the irony. While Trump was fighting yesterday's battles, Mexico was preparing for tomorrow's. The global race for resources was already shifting. Oil and gas still mattered, but the future was in batteries. The lithium-powered engines of electric cars, renewable energy storage, and advanced military systems. China and Europe were pouring billions into securing lithium supplies. Canada was building leverage with cobalt, and Mexico, quietly sitting on massive reserves of lithium in states like Sonora, was beginning to realize its true power. Trump ignored it. He was too busy chasing headlines about coal jobs and tariff fights to see the real battlefield emerging. Worse, his hostile approach pushed Mexico further away, leaving the U.S. less able to influence what came next. And then, in 2022, Mexico made its move. President López Obrador nationalized the country's lithium reserves, declaring them property of the nation and forming a state-owned company to control development. Overnight, the U.S. lost the ability to treat Mexican lithium as a guaranteed supply. This was the backfire of Trump's broken vision. He promised to restore U.S. dominance. Instead, he created the conditions for dependence. He promised to bring back American manufacturing. Instead, he made America's future industries, EVs, tech, defense, reliant on a neighbor he spent 4 years insulting. That's not America first. That's America trapped. And it's why the next chapter of this story is so explosive. Because this isn't just about Trump's failure to plan, it's about the resource that will decide the future of global power, lithium. To understand just how dangerous this dependence is, we need to look at what lithium really is and why it matters more than any other resource of the 21st century. If there is one resource that defines the 21st century, it is lithium. For most of modern history, power was defined by oil. Whoever controlled oil fields controlled economies, militaries, and geopolitics. Wars were fought over pipelines. Nations rose and fell on the price of crude. But today, the new battlefield is batteries, and the metal that makes them possible is lithium. So why does lithium matter so much? Let's break it down. First, electric vehicles. The auto industry is undergoing its most dramatic transformation in a century. Tesla, Ford, GM, Volkswagen, all of them are pouring billions into EVs. By 2030, millions of cars rolling off assembly lines will depend entirely on lithium-ion batteries. Without lithium, there are no EVs. And without EVs, America risks falling hopelessly behind in the global auto market. Second, consumer technology. The device you're holding right now, your phone, your laptop, your tablet, all powered by lithium batteries. Apple, Samsung, Microsoft, every major tech company is built on the assumption that lithium will keep flowing. Without it, the digital economy grinds to a halt. Third, renewable energy. Solar panels and wind turbines don't work without storage. You can't power a city with sunlight at night unless you have batteries that store the energy. And those batteries? They run on lithium. If America wants to transition to green energy, it doesn't just need lithium. It needs a lot of it. And finally, the most overlooked, but perhaps most critical, defense technology. Fighter jets, satellites, drones, even advanced missile systems all rely on high-performance batteries. Without lithium, the Pentagon itself faces vulnerability. America's military edge depends on a resource it does not control. This is why experts call lithium the oil of the 21st century. It isn't just about cars or gadgets. It's about the foundation of modern life, modern war, and modern power. Whoever controls lithium controls the future. And here's the punchline. Mexico is sitting on it. In the northern state of Sonora, geologists have identified one of the world's largest untapped lithium reserves. Estimates suggest it could supply enough lithium for decades of EV production. And unlike faraway mines in South America or Africa, this one is right on America's doorstep. The US doesn't have to cross oceans to secure it. It just has to look south. But here's the tragedy. While China has been locking up lithium supply chains in Africa and South America, and Europe has been securing deals for its green transition, the US ignored Mexico. Trump ignored Mexico. He was too busy waging tariff wars and demanding walls to see that the very neighbor he mocked was about to become indispensable. And now, with lithium nationalized, Mexico isn't just a supplier. It's a gatekeeper. It can decide where the lithium goes, who gets it, and on what terms. So ask yourself, what happens when the Pentagon needs batteries, but Mexico has other plans? What happens when Detroit needs lithium for EVs, but Mexico is selling to Europe or China instead? What happens when the U.S. realizes its future is chained to a neighbor it spent years insulting? That's not speculation. That's the new reality Trump helped create. And to see how that reality took shape, we need to look at Mexico's boldest move yet, the decision to nationalize its lithium and rewrite the rules of the game. For decades, Mexico was treated as little more than a junior partner in North America. Washington dictated the trade rules, American corporations set up factories, and politicians in the U.S. used Mexico as a talking point for cheap labor and border disputes. Donald Trump took that condescension to a new level. He slapped tariffs on Mexican steel and threatened to crush auto imports. He used Mexico as the centerpiece of his border wall politics, portraying it as weak, dependent, and incapable of standing up to Washington. To him, Mexico was a punching bag, not a partner. But then came the plot twist. In 2022, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, made a move that stunned markets. He nationalized Mexico's lithium reserves. Declaring them property of the nation, he created a new state-owned company, Lithium MX, to control extraction, production, and sales. In one stroke, he took the single most important resource of the future and placed it firmly under Mexican sovereignty. The timing was no accident. Around the world, nations were scrambling for lithium. China had already locked up supply chains in Africa and South America. Europe was desperately securing contracts to fuel its green transition. The U.S., distracted by trade wars and political drama, had failed to act. Mexico saw the opening and seized it. And AMLO didn't frame this as just an economic policy. He framed it as a matter of national dignity. He told Mexicans that for too long, their natural resources had been exploited by outsiders. This time, Mexico would not be the quarry for foreign empires. This time, Mexico would decide its own destiny. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. Trump spent years belittling Mexico, insisting it would pay for a wall, mocking its leaders, and treating it as expendable. And yet, here was Mexico, turning the tables, holding the key to America's technological future. This was the underdog story in action. The bullied neighbor rising up, not with armies or threats, but with control over the resource the world can't live without. And for Washington, the implications were brutal. Suddenly, access to lithium wasn't guaranteed. Suddenly, negotiations weren't one-sided. The U.S. would have to come to Mexico on bended knee, acknowledging its power. For Trump, this was the nightmare scenario. He had promised America first, but the very policies he championed had pushed Mexico to assert independence, locking away the resource America needs most. And Mexico didn't just nationalize lithium, it sent a message to the world. The days of being Washington's junior partner were over, which brings us to the heart of America's dilemma, its dependence. Because while Mexico has gained leverage, U.S. industries are left exposed, and the scale of that exposure is staggering. For years, America sold itself as the leader of global industry. The world's cars, the world's planes, the world's technology, all supposedly built on U.S. innovation and U.S. power. But the truth is far more fragile, and nothing exposes it more clearly than lithium. Here's the reality. Without lithium, the U.S. auto industry collapses. Ford, GM, Tesla, all racing to electrify their fleets, cannot do it without a steady stream of lithium. Every EV battery requires massive amounts of the mineral. Every delay in supply translates to higher costs, production slowdowns, and lost market share. The same is true for Silicon Valley. Apple, Microsoft, Google, their devices depend on lithium-ion batteries. No lithium means no iPhones, no laptops, no data centers humming away in the cloud. And then there's defense. Satellites, drones, fighter jets, even next-generation weapons all require high-performance batteries. Without lithium, the Pentagon's technological edge begins to wobble. National security itself is chained to a resource America doesn't control. So where does the U.S. turn? To its southern neighbor. Mexico's reserves, especially in Sonora, are vast, among the largest in the world, and unlike deposits in far-off countries, they're right next door. That should have been an advantage for Washington. But thanks to Trump's tariffs, bullying, and political posturing, Mexico has no reason to treat the U.S. as a privileged customer. That's the irony. Trump promised to shield American workers from foreign dependence, But his policies created a scenario where America must beg the very country he insulted. The man who swore he would make America independent delivered something very different: dependence on Mexico. And this isn't just about economics, it's about pride. For a superpower that has spent decades lecturing others about power and dominance, being forced to rely on the neighbor it mocked is a humiliation. For Mexico, it's vindication. For America, it's exposure. And for Trump, it's the ultimate backfire. But the story doesn't end there, because Trump's trade wars didn't just alienate Mexico, they pushed it closer to America's rivals. And that's where the real danger lies. Donald Trump sold himself as the master strategist, the man who could out-negotiate China, bend Mexico to his will, and restore America's dominance. But in reality, his tactics created the perfect storm for America's own decline. Here's how it backfired. When Trump launched his trade wars, he treated tariffs as a blunt weapon. He slapped duties on Mexican steel, threatened auto imports, and used the border wall as a permanent bargaining chip. Every move told Mexico the same thing: Washington wasn't a partner, it was a bully. Mexico took note, and instead of caving, it pivoted. In 2022, after nationalizing its lithium, Mexico began quietly courting other buyers. Chinese companies, already dominant in the global battery supply chain, saw an opportunity. Europe, desperate for alternatives to Russian energy, also started making inquiries. Suddenly, Mexico wasn't just looking north, it was looking east and across the Atlantic. This is the irony Trump never anticipated. His tariffs and bullying were supposed to isolate China and force Mexico into submission. Instead, they drove Mexico closer to Beijing and Brussels. Instead of cementing American dominance, Trump created a pathway for America's rivals to gain influence just across the border. Think about the stakes. If China secures Mexican lithium, it won't just dominate African and South American supply chains, it will control America's backyard. If Europe gets priority access, the US auto industry risks falling even further behind. And all of it would be traced back to Trump's arrogance. This is the villain arc in full. Trump promised independence. He delivered dependence. He promised to isolate China. He handed Beijing an opportunity. He promised to make America strong. He exposed its weakness. For Mexico, this backfire was empowerment. For the US, it was humiliation. And for Trump, it was the collapse of the very narrative he built his presidency on. Because the truth is unavoidable. In trying to bully his neighbor, he created the conditions for America to lose leverage not just in North America, but in the global energy transition. And the consequences at home are brutal. Because when America loses access to lithium, it's not just geopolitics at stake, it's jobs, industries, and livelihoods. That's the economic fallout we need to look at next. The collapse of American access to Mexican lithium isn't just a geopolitical problem, it's an economic earthquake, and its shockwaves are already visible. Start with the auto industry. Detroit's giants, Ford, GM, even Tesla, have staked their futures on electric vehicles. Billions invested in factories, assembly lines, and research. But without reliable lithium, all of that is at risk. Production slows, costs rise, and in a brutally competitive global market, falling behind means losing billions. What happens when EV prices soar beyond the reach of everyday consumers? Sales plummet, jobs vanish. The very workers in Michigan, Ohio, and across the Midwest, the ones Trump promised to protect, are left holding pink slips instead of paychecks. It doesn't stop there. Higher lithium prices ripple through technology. Smartphones, laptops, medical devices, everything costs more. Inflation creeps further into households already stretched thin. Families don't just lose jobs, they lose purchasing power. And then comes defense. Without lithium, America's military supply chain faces delays. Satellites, drones, and next-gen systems become more expensive, harder to build, and more dependent on foreign goodwill. That's not just an economic hit, it's a national security risk. Here's the cruel twist. Trump promised to shield American workers from foreign dependence, But his tariffs and trade wars forced the U.S. into the very position he swore to avoid. Now, the costs aren't just being paid by companies. They're being paid by every American worker, every taxpayer, every household. And subsidies, they can't fix it. Washington can write checks, but subsidies don't create lithium. They don't build supply chains overnight. They just burn through taxpayer money while the structural weakness remains. The fallout is clear. An auto industry under siege, jobs evaporating, consumers squeezed, and a military edge dulled, all while America pays billions to paper over a crisis Trump's own arrogance created. But this isn't just about economics. The world is watching, and America's rivals are already moving to exploit the weakness. That's where the geopolitical ripple effects come in. The lithium crisis isn't just an economic story. It's a geopolitical earthquake, one that reveals how fragile America's position has become, even in its own backyard. Look at BRICS. China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa have spent years building alternatives to US-dominated markets. Now they see Mexico as a natural partner. A country with vast lithium reserves right on America's doorstep, but no longer tied to Washington's leash. If BRICS secures Mexican lithium, it's not just a resource win. It's a symbolic victory, America losing control in its own hemisphere. Canada is another piece of the puzzle. Ottawa already strengthened its hand with cobalt, another critical mineral for batteries. Now imagine Canada and Mexico, two countries Trump insulted and underestimated, holding the keys to North America's most important resources. The U.S. would find itself boxed in by its own neighbors, the so-called superpower surrounded by underdogs that it can't bully anymore. Europe is watching too. The EU, desperate to transition off Russian energy, sees Mexico as a reliable alternative. Deals that might have once flowed naturally to Washington now risk heading east to Brussels. And then there's China. Already dominant in refining lithium, Beijing doesn't even need to own the mines to benefit. If Mexico sells raw lithium to Chinese companies, China tightens its grip on the global battery market. Trump's trade wars were supposed to contain China's rise. Instead, they may have accelerated it, giving Beijing influence not just across oceans but across America's southern border. This is the global ripple effect. America's rivals gain power, America's allies diversify away, and the myth of U.S. dominance erodes, and the world sees the irony. The empire that once dictated terms is now begging for access to the very resources it mocked its neighbors for holding. The message is clear. The balance of power is shifting, and it's not shifting in America's favor. Which brings us to the conclusion of this story. Trump's villainy exposed, America's weakness revealed, and the haunting question of what happens when the next resource crisis comes. Donald Trump promised to bring back American manufacturing. He promised energy independence, jobs for the heartland, and dominance in the industries of the future. But today, the truth is undeniable. America's tech and energy future is tied to the very neighbor he mocked, insulted, and underestimated. Mexico, once dismissed as Washington's junior partner, now holds one of the largest lithium reserves on the planet. Lithium, the oil of the 21st century. Without it, there are no electric cars, no smartphones, no renewable grids, no advanced defense systems. In short, no future. And thanks to Trump's arrogance, America no longer controls access to it. His trade wars alienated allies. His tariffs drove Mexico toward other partners. His obsession with short-term wins blinded him to the resource battle that really mattered. He promised independence. What he delivered was dependence on the very neighbor he turned into a political punching bag. Now, the consequences are everywhere. U.S. auto giants facing higher costs and global competition. Workers in the Midwest watching jobs evaporate. Consumers paying more for technology and energy. Rivals like China and BRICS seizing opportunities at America's doorstep. And looming over all of it is the humiliation of a superpower forced to beg an underdog for the resource that defines the future. Trump said, "America first." But in the lithium era, America is anything but first. And that leaves us with a bigger question. If lithium exposed America's weakness today, what happens when the next resource crisis comes? Oil, water, food. Will America lead? Or will it find itself begging once again? Trump promised victory. Instead, the world is watching the United States lose one resource at a time. If you want to keep following how these hidden battles over resources are reshaping power across the globe, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because the lithium fight is just the beginning.